Star Walker Studios presents Game Master's Journey, your multi-dimensional RPG podcast. Hello, fellow gamer. Welcome to episode 233 of Game Master's Journey. I'm your host, Lex Starwalker. On this show, we discuss the craft and the art of game mastering. I've been running RPGs for over 26 years now, and I produce this show in the hopes that you can benefit from my experience, my triumphs, and my mistakes. I've got a great episode for you today. I'm returning to the Dungeon Master's Guide, continuing our deep dive exploration of the DMG. We're resuming our discussion of Chapter 5, which is all about adventure environments. In past episodes, we've talked about dungeons and the wilderness. And in our last episode, in the beginning of our wilderness discussion, we talked about traveling in the wilderness using the travel montage approach as well as the hour by hour approach. So if you're new to the show and you want to get caught up, you can catch the first part of the wilderness aspect of the discussion in episode 232. Or if you'd like to go all the way back to the beginning, head to the show notes at starwalkerstudios.com, and I have all of the previous DMG episodes linked there, as well as all of the previous Player's Handbook episodes. So really quickly, for any new listeners, I started out with the Player's Handbook covering mainly the GM kind of side of the screen. Didn't so much go into spells and character abilities and stuff like that. Talked more about running the game and the rules of the game and things that a GM needs to think about from the Player's Handbook. And once we concluded that series, I started a deep dive into the Dungeon Master's Guide. And I've been going through the DMG chapter by chapter, page by page, and just picking out things to talk about from the DMG to help us all hopefully be better GMs, whatever game we're running and playing. So this has been quite a long running series. There's been a lot of discussion, a lot of material, a lot of episodes. So to help you kind of keep track of everything, I have it all linked in the show notes, so you can go there and find all of the episodes in the series. So yeah, last time we talked about traveling in the wilderness, and today we're going to continue our wilderness discussion, talking about mapping wildernesses, how to track movement on the map, things you might want to put on your map, and then we're going to go into wilderness survival. And finally, I would ask you to stay for the end of the show, especially if you've been around for a while, been a listener of the show for a while. After we conclude our discussion of the DMG today, I'm going to talk a little bit about the hiatus between season 12 and season 13. And for those of you that are wondering what was going on and don't already know, I talk a little bit more about, why I took the hiatus, why it was so long, some updates about what's been going on with me kind of personally and in my gaming life and GMing life, and that kind of stuff. And I kind of felt like I owed you all an explanation for taking, I think it was like 3 months off from the show. And the segment at the end where I talk about this was actually originally going to be part of episode 231. And I cut it out partly because episode 231 was getting really long, and partly because I felt like the episode was getting a little too self-indulgent and was having too much discussion of things that weren't strictly RPG related. And I really wanted to start the new season with more relevant content. So I cut it out, and I wasn't sure if I was going to use it or not. But I decided to put it at the end of this episode because I do feel like I owe my longtime listeners more of an explanation, and I wanted to provide that for you. And I'm putting it at the end of the show because some listeners get annoyed when I spend too much time at the beginning of the show talking about things that they don't think are the main topic. So that's partly on me, I think, because I usually pick one topic from an episode to title the episode. And I think that gives some people the impression that the episode's only about that one thing and anything else in the episode is not relevant or whatever. So for those people, and for anyone else that doesn't really care about what's going on with me personally or doesn't care about what was going on with the hiatus, I thought I would put it at the end of the episode, so it's easier to just ignore that if you're not interested in it. But for my longer time listeners and those of you that are interested, I wanted to provide that to you. I also talk a little bit about plans for season 13, the present season of the show, in that segment at the end of the episode. All right, so thank you so much for joining me for the journey today, and let's move on with the show and crack open that Dungeon Master's Guide. All right, so now let's talk a little bit about mapping a wilderness. We talked a lot in previous episodes about mapping dungeons. So what do we need to think about when we're mapping for a wilderness journey? So in contrast to a dungeon, an outdoor setting presents seemingly limitless options, and this can be a little overwhelming, especially for new GMs. The adventurers can move in any direction over a trackless desert or an open grassland. So how do you as a DM deal with all the possible locations and events that might make up a wilderness campaign? What if you design an encounter in a desert oasis, but the characters miss the oasis because they wander off course? How do you avoid creating a boring play session of uninterrupted slogging across a rocky wasteland? And, this is what some people think of when they hear wilderness exploration or whatever. They think it's going to be this long, boring slog with just lots of random encounters that don't mean anything and don't lead to anything. But it doesn't have to be that way. One solution is to think of an outdoor setting in the same way you think about a dungeon. Even the most wide open terrain presents clear pathways. Roads seldom run straight because they follow the contours of the land, finding the most level or otherwise easiest routes across uneven ground. Valleys and ridges channel travel in certain directions. Mountain ranges present forbidding barriers traversed only by remote passes. Even the most trackless desert reveals favored routes where explorers and caravan drivers have discovered areas of wind-blasted rock that are easier to traverse than shifting sand. If the party veers off track, you might be able to relocate one or more of your planned encounters elsewhere on the map to ensure that the time spent preparing those encounters doesn't go to waste. And you can almost always do that. If you came up with a cool encounter and somehow the player characters bypass that, you can almost always put it somewhere else that just happens to be right in front of them. Chapter 1 of the DMG discussed the basics of creating a wilderness map at 3 different scales, and we talked about that in previous episodes, so you can check that out. So next it talks about, choosing the scale of your map, which I feel like this is pretty cut and dry, pretty obvious stuff. Choose the scale that fits what you want to do the best. So for instance, if you're tracking hour by hour movement on a province scale map, which is where 1 hex equals a mile, you can describe each hamlet and village the adventurers pass. At this scale, you can assume that the characters find a noteworthy location when they enter its hex, unless the site is specifically hidden. The characters might not walk directly up to the front door of a ruined castle when they enter a hex, but they can find old paths, outlying ruins, and other signs of its presence in the area, and then presumably if they want to find the castle, they could. If you're tracking a journey of several days, on the other hand, then you might want to use a kingdom scale map, which is where a hex is 6 miles. And on this scale, you're not going to bother with details too small to appear on the map. It's enough for the players to know that on the 3rd day of their journey, they cross a river and the land starts rising before them, and that they reach the mountain pass 2 days later. So again, it's just, how granular do you want to get? And that's going to be partly determined by the length of the journey and how much time you want to spend with it. So if the player characters are taking a really long journey and you don't want to spend forever on that journey, then you're going to think larger scale. You're going to narrate more kind of big picture stuff. Where if the player characters are taking a shorter journey or you want to spend more time with the journey, then you can zoom in more and focus more on individual details and more smaller scale stuff. It's just really what do you want to accomplish and how long do you want to take to accomplish it? So, your map is going to be more than just, where everything is. You also ideally will have interesting features on the map that the player characters can encounter and discover. Things like settlements, strongholds, ruins, and other sites worthy of discovery. So, they suggest as kind of a place to start that you could think about having a dozen such locations scattered over an area approximately 50 miles across, just as kind of a benchmark of, what you might want to shoot for. So here are some different features you could put in your wilderness monster lairs. A wilderness area approximately 50 miles across can support roughly a half dozen monster lairs, but probably no more than one apex predator, such as a dragon. And that's something I often think about for my wilderness adventures is who or what is the apex predator of any area? And I tend to start at the top. I think of who is the apex predator first, and then I decide what else might be in the area. So if I decide that the biggest bad in this area is a red dragon, then I'll probably choose different monsters for the area than if I decide the biggest bad in this area is, I don't know, a stone giant, right? So that's one way you can approach it. If you expect the characters to explore a monster's lair, you'll want to create an appropriate map for the lair and stock the lair as you would a dungeon, so that lair becomes a dungeon then, right? So yeah, and that's another thing, your wilderness can have dungeons within it, and I would say should have dungeons within it. So, you could find yourself transitioning from a wilderness adventure into a dungeon adventure, depending what the players decide to do. So yeah, monster lairs, can be awesome. And again, they suggest maybe 6 or so for a 50-mile area. You can also have monuments. So in places where civilization rules or once ruled, perhaps long ago, adventurers might find monuments built to honor great leaders, gods, and cultures. And they have a table here that you can use for inspiration for coming up with ideas for different monuments. And, these can not only convey flavor and setting and all that good stuff, but they can also be a way to present the players with clues and adventure hooks. Monuments could have things inscribed on them, could have things buried near them or underneath them, could point towards ruins or dungeons or whatever. A monument that the characters stumble across could just be a random thing, or it could be the key to an adventure or something like that. Other features you could have are ruins, crumbling towers, ancient temples, raised cities. These are perfect sites for adventurers. Additionally, noting the existence of an old crumbling wall that runs alongside a road, a sagging stone windmill on a hilltop, or a jumble of standing stones can add texture to your wilderness, and again, could lead to adventure if the players investigate it more. And, this is a way, I talked about finding ways to use things that the player sidestep. Maybe you came up with this dungeon that had a cool treasure in it that you wanted the players to find. And for whatever reason, they don't go to the dungeon or they don't discover it or whatever, they sidestep it, they go on. These kinds of things are ways that you could still use that dungeon. So maybe they find a ruin that leads them to the dungeon, or they find a monument that leads them to the dungeon or points them to the dungeon. The players don't need to know that this was the dungeon that you wanted them to go into 3 weeks ago and they decided not to. They don't need to know that. They wouldn't know that unless you tell them. And you can just take that dungeon and plop it down somewhere else, and they can still find the cool treasure that you wanted them to find. And you can still use your cool dungeon map that you made. Just put it somewhere else. Easy peasy. Just never tell the players. You don't want to break their verisimilitude or their immersion by revealing to them these things that you do behind the curtain. Keep it to yourself. Also, settlements. Settlements exist in places where food, water, farmland, and building materials are abundant. So think about that. Don't put a village in the middle of nowhere when there's no water or food nearby, unless you're doing so intentionally, and maybe that's a mystery the players will investigate. How is this village in the middle of nowhere with no food or water? And maybe that's an adventure you want to run. But, don't do things like that without meaning to. Because if you just put the village in the middle of nowhere for no good reason, and the players are really curious about that and start investigating it, and you don't have an answer for them or something cool for them to find, that can lead to a lot of scurrying behind the DM screen that you might want to avoid. So yeah, think about things like that. Why is this village here? How do people survive here? A civilized province, roughly 50 miles across, might have one city, a few rural towns, and a scattering of villages and trading posts. And I like how they give you these guidelines. So if you're world building, I very much am a fan of the bottom up approach, which is I'm going to build the area where the player characters are first, and we're going to start playing there. And then I'm going to worry about what's beyond that. So, if you're doing that, this is giving you all kinds of guidelines. So start with a 50-mile area. And in that area, you're going to have a dozen or so locations or features. Of those, maybe 6 or so are going to be monster lairs. And then, they recommend that in that 50-mile area, you might have one city, a few rural towns, and a scattering of villages and trading posts. Again, you could have more or less. If this is a really remote area, maybe there isn't a city. Maybe there's fewer villages and trading posts, or maybe there's more. Up to you. But these are giving you some nice guidelines that you can start building an area for the players to adventure in. So again, they're saying a civilized area, 50 miles across, might have one city, a few rural towns, and a scattering of villages and trading posts, while an uncivilized area might have a single trading post that trades at the edge of a wild frontier, but no larger settlements or anything in between. In addition to settlements, a province might contain ruined villages and towns that are either abandoned or serve as lairs for marauding bandits and monsters. So lots of things you can do here. Another feature are strongholds. Strongholds provide the local population with protection in times of trouble. The number of strongholds in an area depends on the dominant society, the population, the strategic importance or vulnerability of the region, and the wealth of the land. And then, of course, you can have some weird locations as well. Things like dead magic zones, wild magic zones, a crystal cave, an ancient tree, a battlefield with lingering fog that occasionally assumes humanoid forms. The list goes on. And they have a table here, a weird locales table, with those and other examples to give you some ideas of weird things you could put in your wilderness. So I think right there, if you're wanting to start a new campaign or run a new adventure and you've got nothing, you don't know where to start, this is giving you some great tools here. Just start with a 50-mile area. Start thinking about, the monster lairs that are there, the monuments that are there, the settlements that are there, the ruins that are there, strongholds, and then any weird locations. And just by coming up with that stuff, you've got a pretty well-developed area for player characters to adventure in. And, those monster lairs and ruins that you came up with, well, those can all be dungeons. Abandoned settlements can be dungeons. And some of your weird locales could be dungeons, or some of your strongholds. Maybe one of the strongholds is actually owned by bandits, and maybe one of the leaders of one of the settlements in the area hires the player characters to take care of these bandits. So then that stronghold could be a dungeon and could be a stronghold for the player characters once they get the bandits out of there. So, just in this section of the DMG, you're given a lot that you could use to build a campaign from or an adventure from. Really great stuff. So finally, in our discussion of wilderness as an adventure location, we should talk a little bit about wilderness survival, because one of the aspects of a wilderness is you do have to survive there. It's not like a city or a town where everything you need is there. As long as you have money, you're okay. In the wilderness, you are on your own. And this is something that, we may want to gloss over in a montage if we don't really care about it, or if the player characters are very capable and survival wouldn't be an issue. However, sometimes it's something you want to focus more in on, especially with low level characters, because as I discussed in episodes where I talked about Wes March's campaigns, one of the cool things about becoming a higher level D&D character is the higher level you get, the less survival is something you need to worry about anymore, especially as you gain access to magic, whether through spells your character can cast as a class feature or through magical items. You get ways to create food and water or purify food and water. You get ways to travel more quickly and more safely, whether that's flying or traveling through the ethereal plane or the astral plane or teleporting, things like that, teleportation circles. All of these things make survival a lot easier because, well, you don't need these long journeys anymore because you're teleporting or you're flying in some way. And so you're avoiding a lot of the encounters other than with other flying things. You can create your food and water, so you don't need to worry about that. You're physically and magically more powerful, so less things in the environment are an actual threat to you. You have more ways of avoiding combat when you want to, things like invisibility, pass without trace, all these things, ways that you can avoid encounters that you wouldn't have been able to avoid at lower level. So that's a cool thing about becoming higher level. And one of the big themes of a D&D game is, you start out not very powerful, not very influential. Even a few goblins are a threat to you. And as you play the game, you advance, your character grows in might and ability, and you become more influential on wider and wider areas, and you become more powerful and can take on more serious threats, and less things are a danger to you. And one of the big part of that is the whole wilderness survival thing. And so if you never deal with that, if you never focus in on the fact at low level that surviving in the wilderness is hard and traveling from A to B across wilderness is hard, then it removes the coolness of getting higher level to the point where you don't need to worry about that anymore. So it can be really cool when, at low level, every journey is an undertaking and involves dangerous encounters and harrowing escapes and things like that. And sometimes even finding food and water is difficult, or you're dealing with diseases and things like that. It can be very rewarding when player characters gain new abilities and suddenly it's like, oh, hey guys, we're never going to have to worry about diseases again because I can cure disease. Or, oh, hey guys, we never have to worry about hunting again because I can create food and water. Or, oh, hey guys, now we can fly on this magic carpet and we're going to have a lot less encounters to worry about when we travel, and we'll be able to make better time. Or, hey guys, now we have teleportation circles and we can get from city A to city B instantly, and there's no travel required. So those can be really fun moments for players as, these obstacles that used to really stand in your way before are now completely eliminated and aren't an obstacle at all anymore. And it gives you this sense of progression, right? But if you never had the experience of dealing with the survival stuff, then you don't get that cool moment. So I know a lot of DMs don't like to focus in on the survival and kind of hand wave it. And so this is my offering as to the downside of that, is that you're not going to get that cool moment in the future where, player characters have advanced to the point where those things don't matter anymore because, well, they never mattered, or you never made them matter, or never brought attention to the fact that they do matter, which means that they didn't matter. So think about that. So wilderness survival, here are some things that help us with that. First, one thing to think about, as we mentioned before, is weather. So we have tables that you can use here to help you decide what the weather is at a given time or allow you to randomly determine using dice what the weather is at a certain time. And that's on page 109. So check that out. That can be a fun thing to do as part of prep. And I usually do this if I'm planning to run something in the wilderness, is I will think about the weather ahead of time, because that can give you details to pull from when you're describing things to make it more engaging, and also can affect encounters and difficulty of things and things like that. So for instance, we have extreme cold. Whenever the temperature is at or below 0 degrees Fahrenheit, a creature exposed to the cold must succeed at a DC 10 Constitution saving throw at the end of each hour or gain 1 level of exhaustion. So right there, if you determine that it's extreme cold, that's going to make everything more difficult. Exhaustion is a wonderful mechanic in this game that I really love. And, one of the problems with hit points is you're just as effective in combat or whatever with 1 hit point as you are with all your hit points. So in that way, they're not terribly realistic, right? So that's one thing I really love about exhaustion is this is a system we can use to show how as you get kind of worn down, as you get worn out, you are less effective. So we can't really see that with how hit points work, but we do see it with exhaustion as you get more and more exhausted, as you get more levels of exhaustion, you're more and more debilitated. There are more and more penalties that you have to deal with, and it makes everything more difficult. And so, just having it be really cold is a way that you bring exhaustion into the equation. And now a lot of those, or even all of those encounters that you've planned, are going to be more challenging because the PCs are also dealing with exhaustion, or they're having to find some way to mitigate that extreme cold so they don't have to deal with the exhaustion. But either way, the player characters have to react to it. Creatures with resistance or immunity to cold damage automatically succeed on these saving throws to avoid exhaustion from cold. So that's a cool thing too. And you can see here, just like what I was talking about with wilderness survival in general, how we have that same thing here with just the extreme cold of, well, if you're a character that has resistance to cold, this is something you don't have to worry about. So while everybody else in the party is making saving throws and getting levels of exhaustion, you're fine. So that's a cool reward for a character that has resistance to cold, maybe because of their sub race or because of a magic item or a class ability or whatever. And, normally resistance to cold is something that really only comes into play if you fight something like a white dragon that does cold damage. But here's an example where just in, a travel scene or montage, you get a benefit because your character doesn't have to worry about the cold like the other characters do. Or if your party plans ahead of time and finds ways for everybody in the party to have resistance to cold, then none of you have to worry about it. Also, characters or creatures wearing cold weather gear, thick coats, gloves, etc., also automatically succeed on the saving throw. So again, an example of how the prepared party that has planned ahead for what they're going to face is going to have an easier time than the party that didn't. And also creatures naturally adapted to cold climates succeed on these saving throws as well. So on the other end of the spectrum, you've got extreme heat. So when the temperature is at or above 100 degrees Fahrenheit, a creature exposed to the heat and without access to drinkable water must succeed on a con saving throw at the end of each hour or gain 1 level of exhaustion. So the extreme cold saving throw was a DC 10. The extreme heat works a little differently. So the extreme cold, it's just DC 10 and that's it. So every hour you're making a DC 10 save. Now, as you get exhaustion, those saves are going to get harder because I think at some point you get disadvantage on saving throws if you're exhausted. But other than that, it's just DC 10. The extreme heat, on the other hand, starts at DC 5 for the first hour, and then each hour after that, the DC goes up by 1. So these saving throws are getting gradually harder as the day goes on, even without factoring in the player characters maybe being exhausted. Creatures wearing medium or heavy armor or who are clad in heavy clothing have disadvantage on the saving throw. So this is another, sometimes people are like, why worry about the wilderness survival stuff and environmental stuff? It's just a pain in the butt. Like, what does it really add to the game? Well, I think it adds a lot. Like we just talked about, extreme cold is going to reward those characters that have resistance to cold. Extreme or who dressed warmly in preparation. Extreme heat is going to reward characters who aren't wearing medium or heavy armor. So usually when you think about it, a character like a fighter or a paladin or some clerics who can wear heavy armor has an advantage compared to a character like a bard or a wizard that can't wear heavy armor, right? And that's something you think about when you're choosing a character to play. It's like, oh, I'm playing a wizard. I can't wear any armor. Or, oh, I'm playing a bard. I can, for the most part, only wear light armor, right? Where the paladin gets to wear heavy armor, or the fighter, right? But in this situation, if you're in a desert dealing with extreme heat, those characters with the heavy and medium armor are at a disadvantage on these saving throws. So they're either much more likely to get heat exhaustion and deal with all of that, or they're going to have to swap out that heavier medium armor for light armor so they don't have that disadvantage. They have a decision to make. But that's a cool thing to deal with. And I really like things like that where in certain situations, characters that normally have an advantage, now they have a disadvantage. And it kind of changes the power dynamics within a given party. And I really like that kind of stuff. It to me, it brings more realism into the game, and it just makes things more interesting because there's more things you have to deal with tactically and strategically. So again, creatures wearing medium or heavy armor or who are wearing heavy clothing have disadvantage on the saving throws. Creatures with resistance or immunity to fire creatures with resistance or immunity to fire damage automatically succeed on this saving throw, as do creatures naturally adapted to hot climates. So similar to the cold there, Another environmental feature could be strong wind. A strong wind imposes disadvantage on ranged weapon attack rolls and wisdom perception checks that rely on hearing. This is a lot of fun. I've dealt with this in my Hinterlands of Elandria campaign. We've had strong wind before, and having a combat and strong wind at range when all the ranged weapons have disadvantage, that really changes the battlefield a lot. Really changes the combat. The whole disadvantage on wisdom perception using hearing makes it a lot easier to get sneaked up on, or to sneak up on someone. It does have an impact, and it can have a sizable impact depending on the encounter. A strong wind also extinguishes open flames, disperses fog, and makes flying by non-magical means nearly impossible. A flying creature in a strong wind must land at the end of its turn or fall. So this is another great thing. I've talked before about how I don't have a problem with low-level flying characters, how especially at low level, I think that flying... giving a low-level character the ability to fly is, as they say, giving them just enough rope to hang themselves with, because characters are so fragile. I think there's much greater odds of the character dying because they're flying than there is them breaking some encounter because they have flying ability at low level. So if you have flying characters, this is another thing to think about. A strong wind, they can't fly in it, or if they are flying, they have to land at the end of their turn or they're going to fall and take falling damage. So another thing to think about. Finally, a strong wind in a desert can create a sandstorm that imposes disadvantage on wisdom perception checks that rely on sight. Next, we have heavy precipitation. Everything within an area of heavy rain or heavy snowfall is lightly obscured, which means you get disadvantage on wisdom perception that uses sight. And creatures in the area have disadvantage on wisdom perception checks that rely on sight. Okay. I just said that because that's what That's what lightly obscured means, but they're spelling it out here for us. Heavy rain also extinguishes open flames and imposes disadvantage on wisdom perception checks that rely on hearing. So if it's a heavy rain, you've got disadvantage on sight and hearing. Then we have high altitude. Traveling at altitudes of 10,000 feet or higher above sea level is taxing for a creature that needs to breathe because of the reduced amount of oxygen in the air. Each hour such a creature spends traveling at high altitude counts as 2 hours for the purpose of determining how long that creature can travel. Breathing creatures can become acclimated to a high altitude by spending 30 days or more at this elevation. Breathing creatures can't become acclimated to elevations above 20,000 feet unless they are native to such environments. So that can come in to play with flying characters or characters riding flying creatures, or if you have an adventure like in a cloud castle or something like that. And then finally, we have wilderness hazards, or maybe not finally, but next we have wilderness hazards. So these are just some examples of various hazards you could put in your wilderness or that characters could encounter. So some hazards, such as slippery ice and razor vine, require no ability check to spot. Others, such as defiled ground, are undetectable by normal senses. The other hazards presented here can be identified with a successful intelligence nature check. Use the guidelines in Chapter 8 to set an appropriate DC for any check made to spot or recognize a hazard. So first we've got desecrated ground, which could be some cemeteries and catacombs that are imbued with the unseen traces of ancient evil. An area of desecrated ground can be any size, and a detect evil and good spell cast within range reveals its presence. Undead standing on desecrated ground have advantage on all saving throws. So right there, have an encounter with undead on desecrated ground, and it's going to be harder because the undead are going to have advantage on all their saving throws, which I'm thinking by memory here. But don't zombies, isn't their mechanic when they would be reduced to 0 hit points, they make a saving throw, and if they succeed, they're instead at 1 hit point. And it can be really annoying when the zombie will not fail the saving throw. You just keep beating them over and over. Well, if they're on desecrated ground, they get advantage on that saving throw. How cool is that? A vial of holy water purifies a 10-foot square area of desecrated ground when sprinkled on it. So there's a use for holy water. And a hallow spell purifies desecrated ground within its area. Next, we have frigid water. A creature can be immersed in frigid water for a number of minutes equal to its constitution score before suffering any ill effects. Each additional minute spent in frigid water requires a creature to succeed on a DC 10 constitution saving throw or gain 1 level of exhaustion. Creatures with resistance or immunity to cold damage automatically succeed on this saving throw, as do creatures that are naturally adapted to living in ice-cold water. Quicksand. A quicksand pit covers the ground in roughly a 10-foot square area and is usually 10 feet deep. When a creature enters the area, it sinks 1d4 plus 1 feet into the quicksand and becomes restrained. At the end of each of the creature's turns, it sinks another 1d4 feet. As long as the creature isn't completely submerged in quicksand, it can escape by using its action and succeeding on a strength check. The DC is 10 plus the number of feet the creature has sunk into the quicksand. A creature that is completely submerged in quicksand can't breathe. And here it tells you to see the suffocation rules in the PHB, which we discussed in previous episodes. A creature can pull another creature within its reach out of quicksand pit by using its action and succeeding on a strength check. The DC is 5 plus the number of feet the target creature is sunk into the quicksand. Next, we have razor vine, which is a plant that grows in wild tangles and hedges. It also clings to the sides of buildings and other surfaces, just like ivy. A 10-foot high, 10-foot wide, 5-foot thick wall or hedge of razor vine has AC 11, 25 hit points, and immunity to bludgeoning, piercing, and psychic damage. When a creature comes into direct contact with razor vine for the first time on a turn, the creature must succeed on a DC 10 Dex saving throw or take 1d10 slashing damage from the vine's blade-like thorns. Then we have slippery ice. Whenever a creature moves onto slippery ice for the first time on a turn, it must succeed on a DC 10 Dexterity Acrobatics check or fall prone. And then we have Thin Ice. Thin Ice has a weight tolerance of 3d10 times 10 pounds per 10-foot square area. Whenever the total weight on an area of thin ice exceeds its tolerance, the ice in that area breaks. All creatures on ice fall through. All right. So yeah, those are just some hazards that you can put in your wilderness, and it would not be too hard to come up with more. So something else you can consider when doing wilderness travel is foraging. Characters can gather food and water as the party travels at a normal or slow pace. A foraging character makes a wisdom survival check whenever you call for it, with the DC determined by the abundance of food and water in the region. So this goes from DC 10 for abundant food and water, DC 15 for limited food and water, and DC 20 for very little, if any, food and water resources. If multiple characters forage, each character makes a separate check. A foraging character finds nothing on a failed check. On a successful check, roll 1d6 plus the character's wisdom modifier to determine how much food in pounds the character finds, then repeat the roll for water in gallons. The food and water requirements noted in the PHB are for characters. Horses and other creatures require different quantities of food and water per day based on their size. Water needs are doubled if the weather is hot. So here we have a chart of food and water needs for creatures from size tiny to gargantuan. And finally, in the wilderness, one must be concerned about becoming lost. Unless they are following a path or something like it, adventurers traveling in the wilderness run the risk of becoming lost. The party's navigator makes a wisdom survival check when you decide it's appropriate, against a DC determined by the prevailing terrain, as shown on the wilderness navigation table. If the party is moving at a slow pace, the navigator gets a +5 bonus to the check. And if the party is moving at a fast pace, the navigator gets a -5 penalty to the check. If the party has an accurate map of the region or can see the sun or stars, the navigator has advantage on the check. If the wisdom survival check succeeds, the party travels in the desired direction without becoming lost. If the check fails, though, the party inadvertently travels in the wrong direction and becomes lost. The party's navigator can repeat the check after the party spends 1d6 hours trying to get back on course. So the DCs for those checks start at the easiest, DC 5 for grassland, meadow, or farmland, DC 10 for Arctic, desert, hills, or open sea with clear skies and no land in sight, and DC 15 for forest, jungle, swamp, mountains, or open sea with overcast skies and no land in sight. And that wraps up the section on wilderness adventures in Chapter 5 of the Dungeon Master's Guide. Just to let you know what's coming up in future episodes in this series, next up is settlements as far as adventure locations. So we'll talk about settlements, mapping settlements, encounters within settlements, all that good stuff. And then after that is unusual environments, which includes underwater environments and environments in the sky. And then finally, we have a section on traps, and that will be the end of Chapter 5 of the DMG. And then following is Chapter 6, Between Adventures, where we're going to talk all about downtime activities and how you can handle those and all the great things you can do between the adventures. So I'm curious, what are your opinions on wilderness encounters and wilderness adventures and wilderness travel? Are you like me and is this one of your favorite stages to play the game on? Or are you not so much a fan of all the wilderness stuff? And whichever camp you fall into, how was this discussion? Was it helpful to you? Some of the thoughts and advice in the DMG, as well as some of the systems that they give us for dealing with these aspects of the wilderness, whether it's navigation and getting lost or the various hazards you can encounter, how the weather can impact gameplay mechanically. Did you find that helpful? Personally, I find this really helpful because, it can be a little hard to just face a wilderness adventure and try to figure out how you're going to make this fun and how you're going to make it feel like a wilderness adventure and how you're going to bring all these things into play. So it really helps to have mechanical examples of, well, here's how really high heat would affect things. Here's how really bad cold would affect things. Here's how being in a thunderstorm with high wind and pouring rain would affect things. And so not only does that tell you what to do in those situations, but it also gives you a framework that you can use for other situations to decide mechanical effects of other things that might be happening in the environment. And those kinds of things can really take an encounter from zero to hero, as they say. It can really spice things up and tend to be things that players will remember later. They'll remember some of those things that they had to deal with that made what might have normally been a fairly easy or run-of-the-mill encounter made it much more challenging because of the weather that was going on or the terrain they were fighting on or hazards they were dealing with, like heat or cold on top of the actual encounter. So yeah. And this can be a way to dial up difficulty on an encounter. If you want an encounter to be really challenging, in addition to thinking about the monsters and the tactics and all that stuff, you can think about, well, what might be going on in the environment as far as terrain and weather and any hazards like quicksand or whatever that might be around that can make this even more challenging and interesting. And there's just a lot of material to pull from there. So let me know what you think of Wilderness. If you enjoyed as much as I do or not so much, let me know what you think of this discussion in the DMG, and do you find it helpful in dealing with the wilderness and maybe give you some tools to work with so it doesn't seem so overwhelming, or so you can make it more interesting if you're someone that's always been kind of bored by it. Has this helped you maybe think of some ways that you could bring it into the story and make it relevant and make it interesting and another obstacle for the player characters to overcome? I'd love to hear what your thoughts on this. Shoot me an email, gamemastersjourney@gmail.com.
This is Matthew Colville, and you're listening to Game Master's Journey.
So I thought I'd talk a little bit today about this hiatus, this kind of unprecedented hiatus between season 12 and season 13. Let you know what's been going on and what's up. And, for those of you that have been keeping up with the show, you already know a lot of why I took a hiatus. I talked about it in some of the previous episodes, but it is true that the break that I took ended up being a lot longer than I initially intended. At first, I thought it might just be a couple weeks or maybe a month or two just to get through the hot part of the summer. And it just drew on and on. And honestly, there were two main things keeping me from coming back sooner than I did. One was just finding the time to produce the show. I suddenly have a lot less time than I used to do things like that. And the other was just coming up with things to talk about. After I'd taken a couple weeks off from the show and I started thinking about season 13 and what I could talk about beyond the obvious things like continuing the actual play episodes and continuing my series on the Dungeon Master's Guide, I was having a really hard time coming up with anything to talk about that I haven't already talked about at least once, if not numerous times. I even a couple times reached out on some of the communities and asked for ideas of topics. And I got some great ideas. And some of those we will be talking about in season 13. But also some of the ideas, although they were great ideas, were things I had covered before. So then I got into this place of, do I do an episode about something I did an episode about a few years ago? Has enough time gone by that I'm going to have enough different things to say about that topic that it's worth doing another episode on it? or not. And some of those I'm still not sure about. For instance, one of the topics that I do want to cover this season that someone mentioned was how I stay organized during the game session, and any tips or tricks I have for just, being on top of things during the session and keeping organized. And, that's definitely something I've talked about on the show quite a bit, but it's also something that I feel like there's probably always more you could say about it. So I don't want to repeat myself and just say the same things again, but hopefully I can come up with some new things to say and some ideas to share with you. So, that's a great topic. If you have any strategies that you've developed over the years as far as how you stay organized at the gaming table, let me know, because you probably have some ideas I've never thought of, and that will help me not just retread old ground when we talk about that on the show. So as I said, the break turned out to be longer than I'd originally intended, and apologize for that. And one of the reasons was that I had a lot going on, and it was hard to find the time. And the second big reason is that, I just needed a break, and I didn't really realize that until I started taking a break and realized how much I was enjoying the break. And yeah, I needed one. I've been cranking out podcasts every week for 3 or 4 years now, I think, if not longer. And it can get kind of brutal. So I needed some time to recharge and think about the show and think about, is there more I can do with the show? Am I just kind of going in circles now? Should I just tie a bow on it and call it done, or keep going? I don't want to run it into the ground. I kind of want to end on a high note. You know what I mean? I don't want to keep going to the point that no one listens anymore, because it's all the same crap over and over again. But on the other hand, I don't want to end the show if there's still more to say. So thought I'd take a break, give it some thought, see what I come up with, and I just figured I was like, hey, if I can come up with enough to talk about for another season, then I'll do that. And then we'll decide whether or not there will be a season 14 when the time comes. Cross that bridge when we come to it. And so, yeah, I've enjoyed the break, and I have some new ideas now. So as some of you have said to me in various places online, and I agree, that it's better for me to take a break, short or long, so that I can come back to the show strong and focused and refreshed and energized. It's better to do that than to keep plugging along when I'm not inspired, or I'm not having fun with it anymore, or I don't know what to talk about, and just put out these kind of mediocre, passionless episodes. So I totally agree with that. And so I think the break was a good thing. So thank you all for your patience and your encouragement over the hiatus. I really appreciate it. And we're going to hit the ground running for season 13. Also, really quickly, I just want to thank everyone who's offered their support and encouragement. Just as a quick update, I have been diagnosed with glaucoma. So far, we're managing that with medication. It looks like we caught it before there was any, at least detectable, damage to my vision. And hopefully the medication is going to allow me to keep my sight for a long time. So thank you to everyone, that offered their support and encouragement. Still dealing with that. But yeah, it looks like it's going to be all right, at least in the short term. Now, unfortunately, it's like one thing after another, right? That's how life is. Unfortunately, my wife isn't working now. So she was making a lot of the money, let me just say. I'm not getting rich making podcasts and at my day job, I can assure you. But what's even worse than the massive reduction in income is we don't have health insurance now, which is pretty scary, especially when you have something like glaucoma that you have to deal with. So of course, the medication is suddenly much more expensive than it was. And the visits to the glaucoma specialist are insanely expensive and much more of a financial burden than they were when I had insurance and just had to pay a copay. So that's a little scary, to be honest, and not entirely sure how we're going to get through that. But, we're just take it one day at a time because, what else are you going to do, right? So anyway, I just want to take a minute to thank all of you for listening, for one thing, to the show. And I especially want to thank all of you who support the show and honestly, who support me in any of the ways that you do so. So thank you to all the patrons. You're the best. I know I lost quite a few of the patrons over the break, which was to be expected. I knew that would happen. So I really want to thank all of you patrons who stuck it out and you're still patrons. You guys are especially awesome. But I also want to thank those of you who left because I appreciate all the support you've given. And, it's not like when you sign up to be a patron, it's a commitment forever, right? I understand that. And especially when there aren't new episodes coming out, it's a really dedicated patron that stays on at that point. So to all of you, I really appreciate all the support you've given me. And believe me, there are no hard feelings on my end about those who left. I totally get it. And I just hope that some of you come back for season 13 and beyond. Also, I want to thank everyone who's bought copies of my 2 D&D supplements I put out, the Trickster's Labyrinth and Relics of Power. I really appreciate it. And, even over the break, occasionally, I'd sell another copy of one of those, and it always makes my day when I sell a copy of one of those books. It's fantastic. I do plan to be producing another supplement soon. Still not sure exactly what I'm going to do. So if you have any ideas or requests or suggestions for a future supplement, whether for D&D specifically or just RPGs in general, let me know. I'm always open to ideas. I've got a few of my own that I've come up with, but I don't have one that I'm 100% certain is going to be the next thing I do. So, the next thing I do might be the cool idea that you give me. And finally, I want to thank all of you who support the show in all the other ways, whether it's using my Amazon referral link. People still do that, which is awesome because I don't talk about it much anymore. Thank you so much. I really appreciate it. People buy t-shirts, which again is something I don't talk about much, but it's something else you can do. Or just telling your friends about the show. Whatever you do, I really appreciate it. Even if you just listen, you just download and listen. I really appreciate it because without you, there'd be no point in doing this. And I wouldn't do it. And especially now, those of you that actually support the show monetarily, you guys are a huge help. You're helping to keep us afloat right now. So I really appreciate it. Thank you from the bottom of my heart, really, truly. So yeah, you're not just supporting the show, but you're actually supporting me and my family too. And, supplemental income is always a good thing, but right now it's especially crucial and especially appreciated. So anyway, enough about that. Thank you, everyone. So what have I been up to? What have I been doing since the last time you heard from me? So I haven't actually been doing a lot of gaming since we last spoke. In fact, as far as RPGs go, pretty much none. I've played some video games here and there, but as far as, tabletop RPGs, I took a break from that. As I think I mentioned, my Hinterlands of Elandria D&D campaign that I was producing actual play for this show is on a break right now as well. But I really want to get back to that. I've got a lot of plans for that campaign. Hopefully me and the players can figure something out. So yeah, once we get that going again, there'll be more actual play of that. I have put together a small group here in Bellingham, Washington, where I live, to play Numenera. We foolishly decided that we were going to play on Fridays. So as you might imagine, that hasn't always worked out well. So we've actually only managed to get together once so far. And we spent that whole session making characters, which I should have anticipated, but didn't. But hopefully we're going to get that going and we're hoping to play that like every other week, just kind of as we can, because it's just nice to game in person. I've been doing so much of my gaming online over the past few years, and it's definitely better than nothing. But there's just nothing quite like being in a room with real flesh and blood people playing a game together. That's definitely where it's at. So yeah, so first time running Numenera in years. It's been kind of interesting returning to that game. Those of you that have been with me a long time probably remember the precursor show to this one, GM Intrusions. It was all about Numenera. If you haven't checked that out and you dig Numenera, you're curious about it, go check that show out. There's 70, 80 episodes of GM Intrusions you can enjoy, which is very similar to this show, only focused more on Numenera. So yeah, it's been interesting returning to that. And that might be something to talk about on the show if you're interested. So let me know if you'd be interested in discussion on Numenera and what it's been like kind of returning to that after, not playing it or running it for a few years. So yeah, that's what I've been up to. And the hiatus, I hope everything makes sense. And I apologize if this episode seems terribly self-indulgent, but I just felt like after so long apart that we needed to get reacquainted. And I wanted to give you some explanation of what's been going on and why it's been so long since the last episode, let you know kind of what I'm planning for the show. So right now we're looking at, I think, 15 or so episodes for season 13, hoping to keep to the once a week release schedule. And the 15 episodes is not counting any actual play. So if I can get Hinterlands of Elandria going again before season 14 is over, then there will be quite a bit more than 15 episodes because we'll have the actual play as well. All right, well, that's going to wrap it up for episode 233 of Game Master's Journey. If you'd like to get a hold of me, there are a lot of great ways you can do so. You can shoot me an email at gamemastersjourney@gmail.com. You can also follow me on Twitter at LexStarWalker. And you can also call our voicemail, 951-GMJ-LEX1. That's 951-465-5391. Or you can find that number in the show notes if you didn't catch it. Love getting voicemail from my listeners and may even use it on the show. You can also join our community on MeWe and Discord. You can find links to those as well in the show notes. If you have any comments, questions, or feedback on the show, I would love to hear from you. Or if you just want to say hi, I'd love to hear from you. You can find the show notes for this and all the episodes at starwalkerstudios.com/Game Master's Journey. If you enjoy the show and you'd like to help support what I'm doing, you can find all the ways to do so at starwalkerstudios.com/support. I've even got some options for you that won't cost you any money. The best way you can support the show, though, and all my RPG endeavors, is to check out my latest self-published D&D supplement, Relics of Power. If you'd like to show off your support for Game Master's Journey, you can also get a Game Master's Journey t-shirt. And thanks again to everyone who supported the show in any of the ways that you do so. I really appreciate it. And thank you to everyone who's purchased my supplements. I really appreciate it and really hope to hear from you some ideas of what I can do in the future, because I'm really excited to do another one. So however you support the show, thank you very much from the bottom of my heart. I really, really appreciate it. I hope that you have a chance to play your favorite RPG this week. I hope you have a chance to run your favorite RPG. I'll be back soon with another episode of Game Master's Journey. Until then, game on.
This has been a Starwalker Studios production, your source for quality gaming and hobby podcasts.
This episode's music, courtesy of Cloudwalker, Transboy, Renfield, Stanko, and Ish. See the show notes for more details at starwalkerstudios.com/Game Master's Journey.